Nobody works all their life to stop work and die. And that's what used to happen.
Yeah.
These days we live a life after we've retired.
See, a lot of individuals have been badly burnt by what's happened in the market, and they may change the way that they do things. I think a lot of professional investors have let them down, and they might be inclined to say, well, I can do this at least as badly as they can.
At the moment, First State Super members have a heightened concern about investments, but by no means a panic. They're certainly asking a lot more questions, and our call centres are fielding a lot more questions than they have in the past.
The members are saying to us, okay, there are some real issues there. A lot of the stuff is coming from the press, and they're concerned. They're concerned about what's happening to their accounts. A lot of our members now access our accounts through online facilities, and they can actually see it. So, yep, there's concerns there.
We have a high proportion in of our members that take the default option, which is probably a reflection of what they understand and where they'd like to be.
Voluntary contributions are certainly dropping off.
It's no use saying someone else was really bad and it's their fault. I don't think members are going to accept that when they're seeing negative returns year after year.
Funds have got several options here. You can do one of two things basically. Run and hide, which means don't communicate with your members, just do the normal paper-based communication with them. Or you can come out in the front foot and try to actually explain to them exactly what's happened, exactly what you see going forward, why things have happened, and try and educate them. I know it's the holy grail to try and engage members, and all funds are trying to do it, but you've really got to get on the front foot.
Our members are feeling very nervous and very worried about the future. Not only are they worried about their superannuation balances, but they're worried about their job security and the job security for their families.
We are facing a crisis of confidence, but the genesis of that crisis is in people's concerns about how the financial system works, particularly in the United States.
It's not surprising that people don't feel confident in this environment.
I think the key priorities that the government are looking at, which I think they've got right, is infrastructure.
As a group, people had become very greedy, and you saw some behaviour which can only be described as egregious.
Superannuation's legalised theft, and I do a much better job of managing my own portfolio at this point.
They should be trying to convince you that this is the minimum amount we can let you lose. They should convince you that we're working so hard that we know that you can't lose any more than this, or this is the maximum you'll lose, you won't lose any more.
Just before I introduce the Reverend Tim Costello, I would just like to take a few minutes to reflect on our theme, building confidence. Now, they say that a week is a long time in politics, and well, 12 months has certainly been a long time in superannuation. 12 months ago, when we were together at CMSF, everything seemed rosy. A world-class retirement system envied around the world, record inflows into superannuation accounts, and continuous years of high returns, thanks in part to soaring stock markets. In addition, a new government friendly to superannuation had just moved into Parliament House, and the opportunities seem endless. Whilst we all knew that returns couldn't continue at record highs forever and that market corrections were on the way, none of us imagined the severity of the global financial crisis and its impact on member returns and retirement benefits. Not surprisingly, superannuation has taken a beating in some quarters. Some commentators have gone as far as to suggest that super is a failed experiment that should be scrapped. So in keeping with our theme, we decided to take the pulse of the nation and see what's on the mind of Australian workers when it comes to superannuation. Some of the results may surprise you, and some you'll be very familiar with from your own work that you do within your funds. So I just want to go through a few main points from our news poll which we conducted last week. Now, on the positive side, and I was a bit surprised about this, 81%, or 4 out of 5 Australian workers, still believe that compulsory super is a good way to save for their retirement. And out of those 81%, more than half of those workers thought that super funds were doing a really good job in this economic downturn. And while switching rates are up, with 23% of workers in our survey having moved or considered moving their super to a more conservative fund, half of those surveyed indicated that they had no intention of switching, even if their funds reported negative returns this year. And there does seem to be awareness that super is not immune from the global economic downturn. 61% of those surveyed expected their returns to be worse than last year. The industry, of course, does have some challenges. 37% of those surveyed who make voluntary contributions indicated that they would not be doing so over the next 12 months. And not surprisingly in the survey, 52% of workers are less confident that they will have enough superannuation to retire on. And 37% of workers now think that they are more likely to have to work past retirement age compared to 12 months ago, again, not surprisingly. And over the next 3 days, we'll discuss and debate these and other challenges as we prepare for more difficult times ahead. But in the meantime, it's time to get started, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the Reverend Tim Costello, Chief Executive of World Vision Australia. Tim Costello is recognised as one of Australia's leading voices on social justice issues, having spearheaded public debates on gambling, urban poverty, homelessness, reconciliation and substance abuse. And since February 2004, as Chief Executive of World Vision Australia, Tim has also been instrumental in ensuring that the issues surrounding global poverty are placed on the national agenda. His passion for justice and for helping to alleviate the suffering of poor communities in the developing world quickly became evident when the devastating Asia tsunami struck on Boxing Day 2004. The leadership he showed at the time helped to inspire an unprecedented outpouring of generosity from the Australian public, with World Vision Australia raising more than $100 million for tsunami relief. Tim also played a prominent role in the Make History Poverty campaign. In 2004, Tim was named Victorian of the Year. In June 2005, he was made an Officer of the Order of Australia, and in 2006 was named Victorian Australian of the Year. We're very fortunate to have Tim here with us today to discuss the many ethical issues that have arisen from the global financial crisis. And he's also going to give us some insights into ethical leadership and how the global downturn is impacting on the most vulnerable people in our society. So please welcome the Reverend Tim Costello.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Fiona, for that introduction. It's pretty much as I wrote it, really. I think this is a very important conference, and it's an honour to be here and to be kicking it off. This month we had a view from the inside of what must have been one of the worst individual examples of governance failures in the history of Western capitalism. Bernard Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 counts of fraud. Madoff ran what is known as a Ponzi scheme from his New York office, where he paid interest to existing investors from the deposits of new ones. He'd taken in something like $100 billion since he began his private investment business in the late 1980s. Investigators have recovered less than $2 billion. He said to the judge, "I knew what I was doing was wrong, indeed criminal. When I began the Ponzi scheme, I believed it would end shortly, and I would be able to extricate myself and my clients." Well, it sounds like the confession of a drug addict, doesn't it? It's not that far off. It's a greed addict. When Clive Hamilton wrote his book Affluenza, it wasn't a comment on individuals as much as on society as a whole. Madoff took his awful sickness to an almost unimaginable level. He's now in jail, awaiting sentence which could be up to 150 years. But that's one example. How did we end up as a society with so much money that could have been lost, with so few prudential checks, with a value shift that seemed to move from thrift to being a spendthrift, of being prudential to being irresponsible? I'm going to suggest to you that the global financial crisis is also a global ethical and a global governance crisis. That the grip of greed and overreach literally overbalance the notion of living within one's means. And I should say this is also on an individual level. The economic writer for The Australian on the weekend said, since 2003, Australians have spent $103.50 for every $100 they've earned. This actually is also a personal level of, if you like, borrowing and excess. Well, we know the current crisis, which began with US excesses and a debt binge that flowed through Europe, has seized the global economy. What I think surprises all of us is just how fast this moved. There is nowhere now that is safe. If ever we had proof that we now live in a global village that requires a global ethic with global governance, this is it. In the past, we in Australia haven't been immune from governance disasters. After the 1987 crash, you might remember the dirty word then was entrepreneur. In some ways, poor old Christopher Skase even played out the biblical role of the scapegoat, carrying the sins of the nation into a wilderness in Spain as we ranted and put our own feelings on him. Well, now the dirty word is bonus. Everyone is looking at executive pay with a horror that wasn't really apparent while their investments were on the rise. The new Obama administration has had a taste of the fury that is simmering below the surface of struggling Americans who finally found their scapegoat in AIG. Even the new chief executive of the American Insurance Group, which accepted more than $170 billion in rescue cash, doesn't seem to get it. Handing out US $170 million in bonuses while the public funds the costs of their massive failures was seen by Edward Liddy, the CEO, as a staff retention issue. That's how he described it. In Australia, the minister responsible for governance, Senator Nick Sherry, has made a very useful contribution, I think, by suggesting shareholders have a say in approving termination payments for executives. And I agree, the shock and horror coming back from business seems really out of step. Do they not get it? Whether it's exactly the right message, I don't know. But in terms of reading the Times, do they not get it? We see this happening over and over again. This is why I think it's an ethical failure. You might remember before Christmas, the three CEOs of the biggest motor companies flew into Washington to put out their hand for $2.4 billion of taxpayers' monies to rescue their industries. They were asked, how did you get here? They looked blank. They said, we flew in. Yes, but commercial or private jet? They all said, oh, private jet. When a no-name congressman from Idaho said, well, are any of you planning to sell your private jets? They blinked and looked blank. No one was planning that. Most of America said they just don't get it. When there is a culture which has normalised greed, when the ethical failure still seems to be off our map because we're talking just about a financial failure, one of the symptoms is that people struggle to get it, to actually name what might also be going on here. Well, in my view, executive pay is a moral issue. It's always been a moral issue in good times as well as in crisis. I suspect the passivity of directors, shareholders and the general community enabled it to lose some of its flinty edge. The superannuation industry has improved its exercise of voting rights since its hands-off approach of last century, but I still think there's much more that can be done. Investors, as you know, cannot follow the intricate details inside companies. That is a job of fund managers to examine these issues carefully before handing over their vote. In the 1990s, some managers stood up on questions of governance. You have some who have led, I think, quite magnificently in this field, but there are others who have hidden behind all sorts of excuses. We do need renewed leadership on these issues, and that, as an ethical imperative, needs to be embedded in your industry. Coming back to executive pay as an issue of governance, it's also an issue of stewardship. And just because the salaries of an individual CEO might be dwarfed by the scale of the business and its cash flow into immateriality, to the fund manager just looking for half-yearly returns, I think the risk of aligning executives' incomes too closely with growth at any cost on shorter and shorter timeframes, looking only at sales numbers without proper assessment of risk, are now very plain to see. Your responsibilities, indeed your ethical imperatives, I think, are now much clearer. But where do we go from here to refashion the blinkered short-termism, the reckless grasping of personal wealth embedded in our corporate culture? If it doesn't come from inside, from new corporate leadership, then it will be imposed in unattractive and clumsy ways externally. We know, and I had the front page of the Australian that you might have seen, the agenda of Rudd going to the G20. We know at the G20 meeting in London, leaders from developed nations will be shaping a new regulatory architecture to try and head off the next round of excesses. Rudd arguing that China and India and Brazil actually have to now be a permanent part of the new governance architecture of the G20. Different voices, not just the G8, knowing that they represent where these failures began, being the only voices. We know that Europe has blocked China and India actually having more of a vote at these conferences and certainly at the IMF. So this is going to be a very interesting test of global governance. We're hoping that what comes out of this will discourage what Mr. Rudd calls extreme capitalism. The fear of reputational damage will curb decision-making at the edges that has been bizarre. But what really changes behaviour inside a company will not be new laws. It will be whether we recognise an ethical and a governance crisis, whether we own it, whether the people who run these corporations and funds actually say, we are part of what the answer has to be. If my house gets robbed on a suburban street, I don't call suddenly for a police station and demand it. I actually say, how do I take responsibility with my neighbours to look out for my community, to be proactive about what's happening? Just new regulation alone will not save us. We also have to own our responsibility. In the past 2 decades, companies have evolved from being run as operations just for the benefit of the owners into entities that are partners with their employers, with their community and with their environment. Words around accountability of businesses to stakeholders, not shareholders, represent this shift. The language of business's role here is the language of corporate social responsibility, a licence to operate. But those words really are just a fancy way at looking at what have always been moral issues. Business leaders doing the right thing, practising good corporate governance. It's interesting how it sometimes is crisis that brings on these changes. The tsunami that Fiona mentioned saw corporates step up and be really generous. Australians per head gave the most in private giving in response to the tsunami, and corporates stepped up like they had never before. It enraged Philip Curry of the Australian Shareholders Association. He took on BHP Billiton particularly and he said, what do you think you're doing? Your job's to make a profit. We shareholders own the business. You return that profit in a dividend. We shareholders will individually decide if we want to give away some of that profit. What do you think you're doing? Don Argus of BHP Billiton said in a little reporter's speech, yep, that's how we all thought once. But now times have changed. This crisis has shown us that we are part of the community, that our licence to operate is granted by the community. And the community is touched and responding, and they expect us to be doing the same. Now, that notion of a licence to operate hasn't been tested in corporations law, that stakeholder language, but it was a very interesting language. I repeat, it's business leaders doing the right thing, practising good corporate governance, having a wider view. It's equally true for NGOs. For us in World Vision, it means us looking at what costs we can save, particularly given that the currency devaluation, when the Australian dollar near parity then sunk to nearly 61 cents, and the monies we'd raised evaporated and we had to cut nearly 20 million from the field, seeing our program staff getting off the phone in tears from our directors in Asia and Africa and Latin America, announcing these cuts was incredibly difficult as a CEO. We have frozen any pay rises, frozen our EFT levels, cut our travel by 50%. From CEO down. I haven't travelled as in business class ever, but we've had a look and said, how do we do this more cheaply? We have looked at how our community consultation programs really empower the community to own what we're doing with them. Having an end point in mind, we leave after 15 years. We don't want to create dependence. These are governance issues for us, for NGOs. Well, in the current crisis, Australia has done relatively well. Our system of corporate disclosure has some shortcomings, but we know that the APRA system has actually protected us, and it may need some more fine-tuning. There are lively debates about short selling that I'm sure you'll be discussing today, but our banking system, perhaps chastened by their losses 2 decades ago, has not been as profligate this time around. And yet we're still hurting. The pain started in New York, spread wide and deep. It reinforces again that we live literally in a global village. Developing countries already under severe pressure from the impact of high food and fuel prices, from another GFC that's been going for 18 months, the global food crisis. You might have noticed our groceries have gone up. When rice prices went up by more than 100% 18 months ago, the worst that happens to us when our grocery prices go up is we don't eat out as much or buy as much takeaway. For the poor, they don't eat. These communities are going to see not just more shortages, joblessness, conflict and instability. They're going to see, according to Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the IMF's managing director, some 400,000 children who would not have died this year actually die as a result of the global financial crisis. Why? Because 85% of capital inflows into poor nations have shrunk. They didn't start this crisis. It started in the US. Because international aid is shrinking, because of currency devaluations, because of remittances to poor countries from their citizens who work abroad, which is really more significant than aid, particularly in Gulf states. This is devastating. The ultimate bottom line, if you like, isn't just superannuation funds back to 2003 levels, it's lives that will be lost. And it's really sad and tragic when you think of the progress we've been making. 20 years ago, 60,000 children died each day of dirty water, not enough food, of preventable disease because they couldn't get access to medicines. 2 years ago, we had got that figure down to 30,000 kids, from 60,000 to 30,000. The figures just out before Christmas, we had it down to 26,000 kids. The campaign to make poverty history actually is making significant progress. The hidden effects of this global financial crisis is the huge increase in those deaths. Well, these consequences are enormous. This global financial crisis is painful. And yet, unless we at least feel the full consequences, widen out our own parameters and vision from just, well, we're worried about super here and Australian jobs and Australian funds, and go, well, yes, but protectionism, we know where that got us last time, and we live in a global village, and if we don't deal with poverty, the poor will go on cutting down the forests for the meagre wood for stoves for their small rice proportions that they can cook. That impacts us with climate change. We have to start thinking globally. Literally, think local and global, now act global and local. This means the crisis of global governance has to ask the questions of sustainability. In repairing governance, it's critical that the business community engage with the problem and be part of the solution. That it realises global poverty, global economics, climate change and security, all of these issues are intertwined. They need parallel tracks. They need a comprehensive approach. It's extraordinarily important to not just think only local now. Well, the 3 steps for the future that I would like to suggest to you is we need better governance at the level of compliance. It means getting things right at the level of laws and regulations, getting taxes paid on time, making sure employees are safe, poisons don't leak from factories, pretty basic stuff. And the result is often better if corporations do it themselves rather than wait for the heavy hand of government to act. That's the first step. And I know you'll be doing a whole lot of workshops around your compliance issues with your own industry. Then, secondly, there is governance of the corporation itself. That question asks, well, what's its reason for being? Is this business adding to the world's problems? Is it making a positive contribution to people's lives? Do they give staff the confidence that they are involved in something meaningful? The third issue is international governance, which we've touched on. We are citizens of the world, and we all know the planet is not in good shape. Its resources are finite, and we know we are going to have to make adjustments for changes in the system because it is at breaking point. Not only are people imperilled, but virtually every ecosystem and organism is now threatened by dangerous climate change. Climate change, for us in World Vision, has morphed into fighting poverty. We, when World Vision was set up in 1950, responded to 50 crises in South Asia, Southeast Asia. Last year we responded to 2. We didn't respond to them all, but there were 250 humanitarian crises. Cyclones, floods, things that just hadn't happened before. That's why Mick Kelty, our Federal Police Commissioner, says by far and away the greatest security issue for Australia is climate change. Mick Kelty. He's not a bleeding heart lefty. He's actually saying the number of boats that'll head our way from Asia and Bangladesh and other places is going to be our future security issue if we don't deal with climate change. Let me just pull this together with a role for super funds. We all know that you're bruised by the global financial crisis, that many have had their assets shredded back to 2003 valuations or worse. But I believe there's a profound role for superannuation funds in righting the system, in realigning the basic values, in talking ethics and governance. As super funds are aimed at the longer term, you particularly have a clear mandate to look past the half-yearly returns and contribute to rebuilding of national economic infrastructure that actually has a clear sustainability centre. As investors, the questions you must ask: are you putting the right filters on your strategies for allocating funds? Do the companies you invest in cut corners, or do they have robust and transparent disclosure regimes? Do they make a positive contribution to society? Or are they looking for fast bucks and likely to be train wrecks in the making? These questions I know are hard to answer. I sat for a while on Reputex's board, and we classified the top 100 private and public companies according to 4 criteria: environmental and social, work diversity and their pro bono programs in the community. And we had a pretty rigorous way of using a formula to grade these companies. We were pretty surprised to find out that in the top 10 companies in Australia was British and American tobacco. Surprised because on most of the criteria, they actually came up really trumps. We discovered that the social criteria, unlike the environmental agenda, which is sharp and focused and able to be applied, the social criteria was quite blunt and ill-defined. So here was BAT, up in the top 10 private and public companies. Shame that they killed 20,000 Australians a year. These questions are tough questions, but they're your questions. Do your investments, the savings of ordinary Australians, work towards a solution to the problems that impact on the future world that your beneficiaries need to live in? You need partnership approaches on these big issues. Partnership by seeing bolder steps by federal and state governments, and support for nation building and sustainable infrastructure by investors. Well, as I've said, climate change and poverty are interlinked in far deeper ways than we have ever understood before. So your investments have to consider humanitarian, economic and security dimensions of these interactions. These have to be factored into the economic models that you use, that governments use, in deciding how much they should invest in the future, particularly in tackling climate change. It's interesting how Bernard Madoff is a metaphor for the problem we have created through a failure to think ahead to the consequences of our wasteful use of resources. Madoff said he knew what he was doing was wrong, but he thought he would be able to extricate himself by just digging deeper into the hole he was making. It's pretty obvious. We have to take stock and have a fundamental change in thinking. You have to, particularly given the longer term frame you have, consider the welfare of coming generations. I think this is an extraordinary challenge for all of us. Nicholas Stern, as you know, the chief economist of the World Bank, whose report 2 years ago woke us up to the possibilities of global warming, told a conference in Copenhagen just a few weeks ago, March the 13th, that unless politicians grasped the gravity of the situation with climate change, it was going to be devastating. These aren't lobbyists, these are scientists telling us this. We have to understand that sustainability is really now our issue. Jeremy Leggett in The Guardian wrote, "Vocational motivation is a vital theme as society works out how to face up to the financial climate and energy triple crisis. As we aim for economic renaissance amid the ruins of free market fundamentalists, the ruins free market fundamentalists have dumped us in, we have the opportunity collectively to re-engineer capitalism into a form with a chance of working. It needs to begin with the way companies are run and the things they stand for. It's why, for mine, the notion of a global Green Deal is the best news around for a renewal of international governance. Obama and Gordon Brown are touting it. I fear that we in Australia seem to be caught in the industrial machine of the old world thinking. Let me say that ethical crises always catch us up in a way of thinking which we're oblivious to. I remember the film Indecent Proposal. I don't know if any of you remember this film a decade ago. Out-of-work couple, married couple, had gone to a casino to try and have a win. He was an architect, couldn't finish their dream home. There at the casino, Robert Redford, playing a multimillionaire, put the indecent proposal to the young wife. He said, if you sleep with me just one night, I will give you $1 million. She was amazed and agonised over it. Said, just let me talk to my husband and think about it. Her husband was furious. He said, no one buys our marriage and compromises us like that. She said, hang on, why are we here? We're here to take a shortcut. We're probably not going to have a win at the casino. Here's the shortcut offered to us on a platter. I'm not giving away my marriage, my heart, my love, my emotions. It's just my body for one night, and we get on with our lives. We finish our house. We achieve our dreams. Well, if you haven't seen the film, I won't ruin it for you. The Herald Sun in Melbourne, when the film came out, did a vox pop of married women asking them, what would you do in this situation? 85% of them said they would sleep with Robert Redford for nothing. Now, before you say, yes, there's principle out there, the story came out. Indecent Proposal was based on a George Bernard Shaw encounter, the great Anglo-Irish writer at the turn of the 19th century. Apparently said to a married woman, will you sleep with me for £10,000, like $1 million? She agonised over it, and she relented. She said, yes, I will. He said, that's fantastic. He said, I've been thinking about this. Will you sleep with me for 1 shilling and 6pence? She was outraged. She was disgusted. She said, that's so improper. What do you take me for? He said, look, we've already established that. We're just haggling over price. Now, can I suggest that when the price is 1 shilling and 6pence, the ethics, the governance issues are dead easy. Someone asking you to compromise and prostitute effectively. When the price is £10,000, $1 million, it's interesting how suddenly the governance issues are very complex. The ethical issues, wow. Now we could have a debate about it, but for mine, the substantial ethical issue hasn't actually changed. All that's changed is the price tag. This is what ethical crises do. They catch us up into a different way of thinking because of price tags. Good governance, good sustainability drives us back to why we're here. Can I also encourage you to be fund managers and trustees who take seriously your values, your alignment, and how it builds a sustainable future. That's the ethical issue. One final story, World Vision's COO internationally is a guy called Dave Young. He was 2IC for Boston Consulting. See, he still lives in Boston, made a zillion. About 4 years ago, came and worked for us. Dave tells the story of being in Africa when he was young. He had been on the back of a truck on this bumpy road that was 2 hours out of an African city in the bush. Those roads, and I travel on them a lot, have potholes big enough just to swallow trucks. Dave suddenly was jolted as the truck pulled to a screech. There was a massive tree across the road. Sitting atop the tree was this African with a tomahawk just chipping away. It looked futile. They realised he couldn't cut through this, so they got out, they got chains, they tried to put these chains around the trunk, but it was just too massive. They realised it could only be human effort, so they all put their shoulders to the trunk and on three tried to heave. It didn't even shudder. More people just appeared out of the bush. This happens to you in Africa. You have no idea where they live or where they come from. You think you're out somewhere remote, and there they are. They all heaved on three and it didn't move. The truck coming in the other way had people. They all got out, same predicament, and heaved. They're about to give up when they said, well, a long bone-jarring trip back. Let's do it one more time before we go. Dave says, I remember putting my shoulder to the tree, and this elderly African man just snuggled in right next to me. He said, I remember because I looked at him and thought, fat lot of good you're going to do. That man started to sing. It was an African song, Dave didn't know it. And everyone was obviously waiting because they knew it as it built up to a crescendo that they were about to hit. And when it hit that point, they all instantly knew to heave. And they did. And the tree moved a couple of inches. They took a breather, shoulders again to the trunk, he started to sing again. The whole thing waited till the crescendo and they heaved another few inches. They did it 10 times till they'd moved it enough just for the trucks to squeeze around. Dave said, you know, that really helped me later in my consulting career. I often thought about it. This massive tree, the mission was always dead clear. The mission was, move this damn trunk. The strategies were always dead simple and they didn't change. Not a tomahawk, not chains. It could only be human labour. He said, so what changed? What changed was that someone, through singing a song, got us into alignment, drew out of us something we didn't know was there, and that alignment actually shifted it. Global governance and ethics, for mine, in the 21st century, in a global village, need to find a song that gets an alignment about sustainability, climate change, longer-term investment than just 6-monthly returns. You are part of singing that song. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got some time for some questions for Tim, and I'm sure there's plenty of people who do want to ask some.
Thank you. I'm Howard Rosario from West Scheme, and I want to thank you for a really inspiring and challenging presentation, Tim.
Thank you.
My dilemma, though, is this challenge for long-term and sustainable investing. We're superannuation funds in the main that operate in a competitive environment. The people who use us as their provider have the right to change and leave and go to another superannuation fund if our returns don't come in right. That seems to be the principal driver for satisfaction with a superannuation fund, returns. Under the long-term perspective, what do we do when the short-term returns act against us and we don't deliver on the expectations of our members? How do we have the conversation that convinces them that what we're doing is long-term and they have to stay with us? I don't know what the line of argument is.
Well, I don't have the magic bullet to solve that. What I'm suggesting is there's got to be a education part, a conversation part, that role that you play with those whose funds you manage. That most of them actually resonate with the same concerns you feel that I've been trying to address. Of course, there are the short-term gains where they say, well, that's someone else's problem. The truth is that the depth of this conversation, the richness of it, really depends on you playing your part in also having that conversation with them. They're concerned for their kids. They're concerned for the fact is that their kids and grandkids aren't going to see the barrier reef. They are concerned, and from Melbourne with bushfires where we had a 47-degree day and 1,200 degrees centigrade heat where tragically bodies were just being vaporised, they know that things are much more unpredictable, and floods up here. So it's finding some way to have leadership around that conversation of a sustainable future. Can I say, and I know I'm talking about people who are extraordinary heroes and giants in our past that I'm not asking you to be, but this is the predicament we always find ourselves in before there is change. When Wilberforce introduced his bill to abolish the slave trade, the empire depended on slavery. No one thought it was nice, but it was impossible to imagine how economically, when the king had slaves and the aristocracy had slaves, when that trade would only be picked up by the French, their enemies that they were going to war with in Britain, how you could imagine dealing with this. So it was exactly, on a much bigger canvas, that issue. Economically, just not possible. We could go through history and name challenge after challenge where we're exactly in that point, caught by it. In fact, the Wilberforce story is instructive because Horatio Nelson, who was bigger to Britain in those times than Kylie and Shane Warne rolled into one after Australians, attacked Wilberforce for ruining the economy, saying, you know, you do this, you ruin the economy. So it was a really full-on attack. And here was someone who actually just stayed with his base, saying the sugar we put in our tea comes from the back of slaves, you've got blood on your teeth. That actually started to popularise it. And ordinary Brits started even going, sugar, I love it, I'm not going to have it in my tea if I'm going to have blood on my teeth. We're running a similar campaign around chocolate and cocoa at the moment because of traffic kids. So that's big picture, simply to say history finds itself constantly in these points. And usually the response is perfectly legitimate, your question, but we're caught. We can't see any way forward. We don't know how to do this. We actually have to have the conversation and push it back, and an education transformation conversation with those whose funds we manage, assuming, rightly, and you'll see this with the polling, that they are moving too. The latest polling said 70%, or it might have been 71% of Australians still think climate change is our biggest issue. And swinging voters, it's higher. So there still is a resonance there, but it's difficult, I agree.
Tim, hi. Colin Tate from Connexus Financial. All I can say is you must have some very interesting family dinner conversations. How much of this do you hold the Howard Costello government responsible for setting the tone, and the Bush governments for setting the tone? And how do you cause a seismic shift in transformation around greed and ethics?
Yeah. You're not a journalist, are you, Colin? Look, I think, to Peter's credit, APRA and the regulation here showed that we were doing much smarter, much better regulation than the US. And Peter would say, and we should give him credit for this, that he had a number of conversations with Alan Greenspan about the looseness of the American system. However, there is no doubt that, you know, when we had it so good, it would have been nice if instead of leaving a surplus of 20 billion, there'd been a surplus of 40 to 50 billion. I think before the last elections, the Howard government did return a whole lot more to maybe special interest groups that, if it had been salted away, might have meant that instead of having a huge debt now, in this financial crisis, we might have still had something in the kitty. That's just a faint criticism, because governments in good times always assume it's going to keep rolling on, and very hard to predict this. Peter, I think to his credit, and he's on record as saying this, actually said over 18 months ago, well, 2 years ago when he was still in government, some really tough times are coming. This bubble's going to burst. If there's bulls, there's going to be a bear. But I don't think we are, in the fat years, put away necessarily enough for the lean years.
So please join with me in thanking Tim Costello.